All right, welcome everyone to our third webinar in our Enough Already virtual 2025 conference. This four-part webinar series covers topics integral to responding to and preventing sexual violence in the workplace. Thank you for your commitment to preventing sexual violence and to worker safety. Last week, we covered the role of regulators in preventing sexual violence, as well as the harm of non-disclosure agreements to workers. Today's topic is Guidelines for Preventing Workplace Sexual Harassment, a Leadership Approach. My name is Tal Marsley, and I'm the Communications and Community Outreach Specialist for Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan. I'll be emceeing this event, and my coworker Carol will be with me, and she will be helping out with the chat. If you have questions, please put them in, and we'll make sure that Stephen sees them today. As we enter into this time together, I would like to lead us in a land acknowledgement. Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan acknowledges and honors the enduring presence of the people who have cared for this land since time immemorial. The Nehiyawak, the Nakawininiwak, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Denusline, and the Métis-Michif Nation. We reaffirm our commitment to serving all of Saskatchewan treaty territories, including Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. We recognize that the spirit and the intent of the treaties has not been fully honored, and that our communities suffer from the legacy of colonization, including dispossession, discrimination, and systemic violence. Thus, as treaty people, we are committed to decolonizing our work, our practice, and our relationships as we confront the injustices that continue to impact people's lives today. We are dedicated to moving beyond acknowledgement by building relationships and working in partnerships with Indigenous peoples in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, humility, respect, and reciprocity. Thank you. We have a few more items today before I let our presenter take it away. And I'll start with introducing the Enough Already program. Enough Already is a program offered by Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan. It seeks to prevent and address sexual harassment in Saskatchewan workplaces. We are committed to working with governments, businesses, industry associations, and unions to make workplaces across Saskatchewan safe for everyone. Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan is a provincial nonprofit organization that works collectively with frontline agencies, community partners, and governments that provide support and advocacy for those affected by sexual violence. We support our 13-member agencies and our partners across the province through research, education, policy development, and advocacy. This virtual conference is part of our Sexual Violence Prevention Month offerings. You can learn more about Sexual Violence Prevention Month on the Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan website, which will be up in the chat in just a moment. We're able to offer this conference at no cost to participants thanks to our generous funders. The Law Foundation of Saskatchewan is our Enough Already program funder, and Sleek Signs, SGI Canada, SIGA, the Saskatchewan Union of Nurses, and Service Hospitality are our Sexual Violence Prevention Month sponsors. Thank you for your generosity. We couldn't do this without you. Today's topic may bring up difficult memories, emotions, and thoughts, and I encourage you to take the space that you need to take care of for yourself. Please take breaks as you need them. If you're looking for support, Carol is going to put into the chat a list of links that link to support resources throughout Saskatchewan and Canada, including some crisis helplines. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenter. Stephen F. Moorgen works currently in the field of human trafficking for the Salvation Army. He loves his job as it allows him to work for and with individuals that are often marginalized and overlooked. Prior to his work in human trafficking, Stephen spent 14 years working in law enforcement, 4 years working for the Ministry of Labor Relations and Workplace Safety, as well as 1 year working in education. Stephen has 3 biological children as well as 2 foster children. And with that, Stephen, please take it away. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the honor of being able to be here today to present with SAS. I do appreciate the work that SAS does, and when SAS says that they are involved in active collaborations with and partnerships with others, I just want to affirm that in the work that I do, that SAS has become a huge partner with the work that we're continuing to do in the province and in the territory around here, as well as nationally in Canada when it comes to human trafficking and education and awareness. That being said, you heard a bit of my background, and that's what I want to talk to you guys about today when it comes to harassment, specifically sexual harassment in the workplace, what it is, defining it, and how we can move forward from there. So bear with me. I am going to share my screen with you guys, and we're going to just jump right into the presentation. Someone be bold enough to tell me, can you see my slides?
We can see your slides, thanks.
Perfect. I appreciate that. So here's what we're going to do today in the time that we have. We're going to have a conversation about the prevalence of sexual harassment in Saskatchewan workplaces. We're going to talk about the business impact of sexual harassment, as well as some leadership best practices for preventing and addressing sexual harassment. And my favorite piece that I'm really excited about is when we have some open discussion and some Q&A about what we can do and how we move forward from here. It's one thing to sit here and get this knowledge. The next part that makes me excited, and I know that SAS is very excited about as well, is to jump into how we can work together to be proactive when it comes to preventing this type of behavior in the workplace. So let's talk about what sexual harassment is. Sexual harassment is any form of unwanted verbal or nonverbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature, violating individual dignity and creating a threatening or hostile environment. Sexual harassment may be verbal, physical, or visual. It may be one incident or a series of incidents combined. But the important thing to know is that it is always unsolicited and unwelcomed. Back in the day when I started working with the Ministry of Labor Relations and Workplace Safety, harassment was grouped into two separate but distinct categories. And those were personal harassment, which we would call bullying, and also prohibited harassment, which would be harassment based on the prohibited grounds set out by the Saskatchewan Human Rights Council. So that would be harassment based on age, race, sex, gender, marital practice, physical size, stuff like that. But in 2021, legislation changed and now includes sexual harassment as a standalone component of the legislation. So in addition to personal harassment, prohibited harassment, there's now sexual harassment. Part of the reason why sexual harassment has now been included in a standalone capacity is sadly because it speaks to the pervasive and commonly gendered nature of this crime, meaning that a large number of women, statistically speaking, are affected by it. And so therefore it's given special consideration as a special form of harassment. So when we talk about it, could be verbal or nonverbal, physical, what does it look like? Verbal harassment could be inappropriate jokes, comments, sexual advances. Nonverbal could be stuff that is a little more overt, like staring, suggestive gestures, or inappropriate emails. It could be physical, like unwanted touching or blocking of movements. It could also be the shadowing of movements towards a particular person over a repeated amount of time. There could be the request for quid pro quo, as it's called, which is a request for sexual favors for workplace benefits, including advancements in your workplace or demotions should you not comply with the behavior. While this isn't an exhaustive list, this is typically where we see the behaviors. And these behaviors can happen online, through email, or in real life. I want to tell a story that makes this and contextualizes this a little bit. I know that often when I was investigating cases like this, someone would say, well, it happened outside of work, so what can I do? I do want to bring a couple things up here for the employers in this room, is if the harassment happens at an event, specifically the sexual harassment happens at an event that is paid for by the employer still has an obligation to protect the staff. Because it is a work function. Now, what's happened historically, and I can speak to this having investigated a number of these cases, is the legislation doesn't protect behavior that happens outside of the workplace and outside of the actual established working environment. However, if that behavior that happens outside of the workplace now comes in, everything is now allowed in. So I'll give you an example of this. I was investigating a case where the workers in this environment one day were sitting in a garage drinking some beer, and they started texting another guy that wasn't invited. That's allowed, so to speak. Then they started texting some inappropriate things to him. Again, it was outside of work. The legislation doesn't talk to it. However, a couple days later, one of those guys in the garage said, "Hey, I bet you liked what we said." That now brought the outside behavior into the workplace, and now the whole parcel, so to speak, could be considered in the investigation. So to the employers in the workplace, I just want to, on this call, I should say, you obviously can't protect what's happening outside of work, but I do want to make you aware that outside behavior brought into the workplace can now be considered part and parcel for any investigation into sexual harassment in the workplace. One of the things that happens in sexual harassment is it's all about a power dynamic that exists and a disproportion or an imbalance in it. Sexual harassment is often about power and control. Sadly, there's a lot of vulnerable groups that are susceptible to this. And they include our Indigenous people, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, newcomers, visible minorities, people from the 2SL LGBTQ plus community, young workers, people with disabilities, or low wage, low earning workers. Part of what I see, and I'll tie it into what I do right now when it comes to human trafficking work, is there's also a power disparity that happens with workers that are sponsored to come to our country on a temporary foreign worker program or what we would call like a closed visa. And in the work I do and in work similar to SAS, is we're seeing that these people that are sponsored to come here, those individuals are on a closed work permit. They have to work for the employer that sponsored them. And that's where we're seeing a real abuse in the power of and the scope of influence that the employer has over the person that's sponsored to come here. So I say all this, and you guys have heard through the past presentations, as well as SAS's involvement in the community about sexual harassment, about the sexual assault services of Saskatchewan and everything they do. But I want to contextualize this. How prevalent is this here in Saskatchewan? So Stats Canada in 2024 did a survey and did some research, and they said that 38.7% of men and 49.5% of women in Saskatchewan have experienced workplace harassment or sexual assault. And that's an alarming number when we talk about how this is a gendered issue. Let's round up to 50%. 1 in 2 women in Saskatchewan have experienced workplace harassment or sexual assault. And almost 40% of men. So to contextualize it, this is a problem that's happening right here in our backyard. And at the end of this presentation, we want to empower everyone on this call with the ability to work together, but to reach out to resources or collaborators in the province to help eliminate, because our goal is to see this number drop. In a 2-year period between 2019 and 2020, occupational health and safety investigated 393 harassment complaints in the province. As of March of 2020, 10% of all formalized human rights complaints in Saskatchewan allege in some form or another of sexual harassment. So for the people in this room that are employers, I just want you guys to think about, imagine how that is impacting the workplace at all levels. If we know that the rates are so high that it's 40% of men, 1 in 2 women, 50% of women. Imagine the influence that's having on our workplaces and on its culture. The sad part about what we see, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is that research shows that 75% of sexual harassment complaints or allegations actually don't get reported formally to the employer. So I want to ask, and obviously feel free to unmute at this point, anyone on the call, why do you think that these complaints aren't being reported? For anyone bold enough.
Possibly anybody that is in a leadership role.
Okay, so who the complaint is against? Is that what you mean?
Yes, maybe
yeah. Absolutely. Yep, for sure. Absolutely. Some of the common things that we found for why employees don't report sexual harassment is fear of retaliation. And to that last comment that was made, if it's the boss, if it's the manager, senior manager, the executive council, so to speak, of that organization, there could be retaliation or the fear of retaliation. What about the belief that nothing will change or nothing can be done about it, or a lack of understanding about how to report? So when we look at this, I want to point out some key words in here that we're seeing come from the employees: fear of retaliation, a belief that nothing will change, or a lack of understanding. When I think about this, when I contextualize this to the people that are surveyed and to the employers on this room or the management level here, that sounds like there's a pretty significant training gap, doesn't there? If there's fear, well, we haven't told them about their protection under the Saskatchewan Employment Act and the legislation about discriminatory action. And I'm going to talk about discriminatory action here a little later in the presentation. I believe that nothing will change. Well, maybe here on the call, we need to talk about how we create an environment and foster an environment where every complaint that comes forward is investigated, where the employees feel like whether the complaint is substantiated or not, that there's going to be due process allowed for. Or maybe there's a lack of understanding about how to report. And I do want to talk about this again at the end, where every employer in Saskatchewan is required by legislation to have a harassment policy that speaks to what is and isn't, the definition of harassment, and how complaints are to be reported, including if it's your direct report. So to the point of the last comment that was made about if it's your boss or direct report, there has to be a process that allows you to complain above the chain of command, so to speak. Other reasons why people don't report, again, maybe there's concerns about the reporting process, again, clarity, or maybe there's a gap in there. Maybe they feel like there's a lack of proof in terms of what they're feeling is happening in the workplace. Typically, there's a saying that says it's a he said, she said type mentality. Maybe they feel embarrassed or ashamed about what's happened. Maybe they've personalized it and they're blaming themselves for what's happened. Or maybe it's that they feel like what happened wasn't serious enough to report. But in any case, proactive stance, which we're going to empower you guys with here at the end, will help eliminate some of these concerns. The last thing that we sometimes see occur is that many workers feel that their managers, supervisors, that the business owner don't actually genuinely care about their well-being in this area. And that means that for everyone on this call, the leaders in this room, we have to take proactive steps to demonstrate our commitment to harassment-free workplaces in all its forms, and our commitment to cultivate a culture where employees feel safe and supported in speaking up without fear of retribution. When we talk about an escalation of sexual harassment, this is a slide that was created by the Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse. And what it shows here is a progression in terms of the normative or the culture that exists at the bottom towards the action that is formalized at the top. So on the bottom, we see stuff like the attitudes and the beliefs that we allow into our workplace culture. Those could be based on racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia. They progress into verbal expressions of it. Here's where we might see the jokes come in, or the posting of inappropriate things in the workplace. And then the top of that scale is the physical expression, where there's often a touching, a groping, or an actual sexual assault that occurs in the workplace. The thing I want to point out, and I'm sure you guys have seen pyramids similar to this in your guys' experience, is that there's a progression that starts at the bottom and works its way up to the top. So typically on the bottom, when we talk about attitudes and belief, we would use phrases like, hey, that's locker room culture, where it's said in the room, it happens in the room, it's just normalized behavior. Stuff like the old boys club. This is just how it's always been. It's just, you typically see this again where there's a huge level of disparity amongst the person that is accused of the harassment and the person that's bringing forward the harassment. And typically and sadly, we often see this with people that are, and when we talk about the gender-based approach to this, with women that are non-traditional roles. So when we see women going into industry, an environment that typically has been male-centered for a long time. When I put up this slide and I show you the name Giselle Pellicott, how many of you guys are familiar with this or read about this over the last 2 years? So for those of you that don't know, and as the headline says here, Giselle was raped by approximately 51 men. And what happened was that I'll call it what it is. The trafficker of this was her husband. And what the husband did was he would drug her and then invite men in the local community that she would know or that were in the surrounding communities around her to assault her in her own home. It started with a group chat about sharing rape fantasies about their wives, and then actually escalated into the physical rape of this woman. So when I come back to this slide here about attitudes and beliefs, we see a progression in this very specific case where it was normalized. It was an attitude. It started as fantasy. It worked its way up to the induction of drug, and then next thing we know, to the actual rape of this person. In the end, her husband was sentenced to 20 years in jail for this, but this woman, Giselle, has now had to deal with the fallout of that as well. What's interesting is that while not all the men who were invited into that group chat sexually assaulted her, not even one of them ever thought about reporting it to the police or to any authorities about what was happening to her. And what I want to point out is it's easy for us to say, like, how could you not think about reporting this to the police or the authorities when you know that what was happening was so bad? But I want to contextualize that to what we're doing here now and what we're talking about when it comes to sexual harassment in the workplace. What is our responsibility for all of us here on this chat? We look at those men that didn't do anything. What about us here in this chat? I think we all have a responsibility if we know something is happening in the workplace that we need to speak up. There's lots of sayings, there's lots of slogans. Again, especially coming from a law enforcement background and doing the work I do now in terms of partnership with other industries. If you see something, say something. And I think that's the attitude that we need to continue to bring forward in our workplaces when it comes to sexual harassment. If we see something, say something. If we see something, step up and step out, because we have a responsibility, all of us corporately in this room, on this call, in our workplaces, in this province, to step up when we know something is happening. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the legal aspects when it comes to the sexual harassment legislation and some of the civil liability for employers. Every workplace is legally responsible, I mentioned this earlier, for creating a healthy, safe, and respectful workplace free from sexual harassment and related retaliation. So what does that mean? For everyone that's an employer in this room, or if you're an employee, you can go and look now. Your employer is required to have a formal, posted, written policy related to harassment in the workplace. It has to define the terms, what is harassment, and it has to also define what the reporting mechanism is should you be the complainant of any form of harassment in the workplace. Employers must take every reasonable step to prevent workplace harassment. This can include practical measures like ensuring well-lit workplace, but also addressing workplace hazards and potentials. Whether or not an employer is aware of sexual harassment, the institution, the employer, is responsible for the actions of management and the supervisory personnel, and for the harassment and that may occur in the workplace in certain circumstances. So again, if you don't have, you're an employer in this room and you don't have a harassment policy, SAS has a lot of resources available that will help you create a policy related to harassment. If you're an employee on this call and you're not sure about how to do it, your employer is required to have a policy. So go and ask your HR about it. If it's a smaller place, like a mom and pop shop, maybe just bring it to their attention that there needs to be a harassment policy in place by law, by legislation. What's interesting when we talk about sexual harassment and we talk about how it would be investigated in any finding of it, sexual harassment is measured by impact and not intent. It's important to know that for the purpose of an investigation, sexual harassment is, again, measured by impact and not intent. If your employee reports negative impacts from the harassing behaviors, you have an obligation to investigate the complaint regardless of the intent of the other person, especially if there's an ongoing pattern of unwanted behavior. So, typically what we would see is an excuse. Well, I didn't know it would have. I didn't mean for this to happen. Again, those are excuses. The sexual harassment is measured by the impact of what has happened on that person and not the intent of the person that is doing the harassing. I mentioned it earlier, and I want to talk about this just briefly. We talk about sometimes people are unsure, unaware of what to do if they report or they're scared to report. In my opinion, one of the strongest pieces of legislation that exists in the Saskatchewan Employment Act and under the OH&S regs is what we call discriminatory action. Discriminatory action prevents an employer from terminating an employee who has brought forward a complaint in good faith. Now, at the end of that investigation, maybe harassment isn't substantiated. That doesn't mean that the person lied by any extent. It just means that it wasn't substantiated. But as long as a complaint is brought forward, and the keyword is in good faith, an employer is not allowed to terminate an employee for bringing forth that complaint. Typically, and in other jurisdictions, and broadly speaking, this would be called like whistleblower protection or the Whistleblower Act and stuff like that. In Saskatchewan, we call it discriminatory action. And the legislation actually sits and reads as that if you have been subject to discriminatory action for bringing forth a complaint, there are certain bodies within occupational health and safety that can reinstate you to your job, and there's a mechanism in place for the recovery of lost wages that occurred during that time. So I do want to bring that forward. If you're an employee in this room and you want to put forward the complaint, but you're worried about it, there's protection as well. And I do want to bring a reminder to everyone on the call is that sometimes the path of least resistance would be, well, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm just going to fire the person. That's not allowed by law. And there are actually very serious consequences for someone that would engage in this kind of behavior. Again, what's called discriminatory actions. So what are some of the consequences that can occur? There's lawsuits, decreased productivity, an increased number of sick days and turnover, reputational damage, and decreased team cohesion. Does anyone want to guess? And again, there's no wrong answer. We're all learning here as we go. What do you think it costs the Canadian economy every year for mental health related injury or sickness in the workplace? What do you think is the dollar figure equated with that in Canada per year? Anyone have a guess? The last study that came out estimated that the direct cost of mental health to the Canadian economy sits at over $50 billion annually. So this is a problem that has a financial impact. And for those of you that are business owners or employers in this room, it's something we need to be aware of. So when we talk about that $50 billion cost to the economy, there's direct costs as well as indirect. Direct costs, again, would be the healthcare costs, lost productivity, like we talked about, disability claims, employee turnover. I know that right now retention is a huge thing in just about every sector, in just about every industry. And if we're seeing harassment go on, or people just quit as a result of the inaction or the pervasive nature or the continuing nature, that's one of the direct costs associated with a failure to act in this regard. There's also indirect costs like absenteeism. Sick days go up. There's something, I don't know if you guys have ever heard about this, called absenteeism is when people just don't show up, so they're using sick days. Presenteeism, which is basically if someone shows up, but they basically punch in, they punch out. Reduced efficiency, reduced quality of work. That's an impact on the employer very physically, very tangibly. There's administrative costs, there's training and recruitment costs like we talked about, and that continual cycle of there's a termination of the working relationship in one form or another, and then you're repeating over and over. And then the other one that I want to talk about is reduced innovation. If you sat in a workplace where people are just punching in, punching out, the saying coming from law enforcement is stay gray. Don't do anything to come on the radar, don't good or bad, right? That sounds like a place where there's not a lot of creativity encouraged, or a place where there is a lot of innovation. So I want us to just be aware that there is a physical cost to what we're seeing here. If you want to break down the numbers, again, based on this study that just came out, that in essence, when they estimate the amount of eligible workers in the workplace at that $50 billion, that's a cost of about $1,500 a person in the workplace when it comes to the effects of mental health and the consequences of ignoring the impact of what we're seeing here. There's other things like I mentioned in there, like reputational damage. with both sides of, it's a double-edged sword with both sides of hurting you. Clients and customers are less likely to conduct business if they feel like this place is known for its for the sexual harassment or the culture that is unhealthy. And additionally, qualified candidates, when you're trying to recruit, may not want to be there. Word travels quick, especially in Saskatchewan, about places where you may not want to work because of a culture that is pervasive. I do want to say this, and I do want to talk about what SAS has to offer here. SAS has some pretty extensive prevention training for the employees, and it's actually a very effective tool to demonstrate your commitment to the issue of harassment in the workplace. So while this is an overview, and I'm rushing through it, and I apologize for that, if you want follow-up information, sessions, workshops, please feel free to reach out to SAS, because they have a lot of specifically tailored workshops that can do specifically for the employer, specifically for the employee, talking broad stroke about some of the consequences and some of the trends. So I do want to make you guys aware that while this is rushed, and I hope you get something out of it, please continue this conversation with partners in the community. Continue this conversation amongst yourself if you sit at an executive level about how to move this topic forward. And please engage the services of SAS, because they are here to help with everything that you probably have questions about. So I said I wanted to spend some time on this, and I do want to leave the last few minutes just to talk about what can you do for those of you that sit in a role where you could bring change or influence, or you have a sphere of control. Here's some of the best practices, and again, this is not extensive. Please reach out to SAS for more. They have an extensive toolbox when it comes to some of the stuff. How about this? How about clear and accessible anti-harassment policy? And that's not just a suggestion. I would say you should know that it is legislation in Saskatchewan that you are required to have anti-harassment policy. That policy is great, but if the staff don't know it exists or they don't know where to find it, that's also a gap. So do regular training for all the employees and managers about it. Here's a practical idea or suggestion. If you guys do monthly meetings, or what we call the Monday morning muster, where you talk about the week, use 5 minutes to talk about your harassment policy. Use 5 minutes to talk about trends. Use 5 minutes to bring a video about it to move this topic forward. When it comes to your harassment policy, again, make sure that everything about it is confidential, and that there's the right reporting mechanisms in place. I know, and I don't want to spend a lot of time here going on this, but patients will talk about some investigation practice coming up and some best practice there. So I'm going to leave that opened at the end here. And again, I'm moving through this really fast, and I apologize for that. I do want to talk about this, though, when it comes to investigations, receiving of a complaint. And that's the standard of proof. If you guys watch any crime shows in the States, or you watch anything with a Canadian context, we often talked about the standard of proof. And in the criminal courts, and again, I came from a background in law enforcement and justice, the standard of proof is what we call reasonable doubt. So the judge, or in a judge and jury type trial, has to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt of the guilt of that person. When it comes to harassment in the workplace, specifically sexual harassment and the complaints that go forward, the standard of proof is actually much lower than that. And that's what we call a balance of probability. So that means that it's more likely than not that what happened can be substantiated. So the threshold, so to speak, is very low. So for our employees that are worried about putting in a complaint, the standard is very low. For the employers in this room that are investigating, again, the standard for you to come back and substantiate a claim is very low if that's the case, because again, it's a balance of probabilities. It's 5 versus 4, if you want to think about it. More likely to have happened than not have happened. When you go back, and I would encourage all of you guys to go find the Saskatchewan Employment Act, to read through it, to read through the regulations on the back end of that. When you look at the definition of harassment, there's some very particular wording that's there, and that says ought reasonably to know. And what that means is the behavior that has caused the complaint, the accused in here ought reasonably to have known that what they did was inappropriate. So what does that mean, ought reasonably to know? It's what they've called the reasonable person test. So remove it from the environment, remove it from the context of that specific complaint. Would a reasonable person know that what they have done could have caused, not did, but could have caused this person to feel harassed, whether it's personal, whether it's prohibited, whether it's sexual harassment. So again, I want to say that just because this is historically been there's been context and there's been culture that's been allowed and it's been normalized, would a reasonable person removed from that environment say that this is unacceptable? That's the threshold we're dealing with. And when I say that to you, it sounds pretty low. And I want to tell you, it is pretty low, the reasonable person test. And again, sexual harassment is never acceptable in any form, in any capacity, in any work environment. Just because it's existed in the past, just because it's been male-centered in the past, just because it's been in non-traditional roles for vulnerable groups, doesn't mean that it has ever been accepted, nor should it ever be accepted. Again, I apologize for having to rush through this here. Can we, Tal, can we just show that bear video quick? So while let's talk about a specific issue that exists in the United States and in some contexts Canada with those numbers, I do want to make us aware of the fact that, let's bring it back to where we started today, that almost 49.7%, so almost 50% of women in the workplace will experience harassment or sexual violence. And it's never okay by that number. If 1 in 5 is what they're talking about here, we're talking about a number that's greater than that. We're talking about 1 in 2. So if you see something, we have an obligation to step up. So I want to spend the last few minutes here just encouraging you guys to take a proactive approach and not a reactive approach to harassment in the workplace. Take reasonable steps to protect your workers before harassment occurs. So again, create a policy. If you don't have one, reach out to patients, reach out to Carrie and the staff here at SAS. They can help you create one free of charge. Approach struggling workers, conduct regular inspections, review policy, and identify potential risks. I mean, we're so good at saying, hey, this is a trip hazard, this is a lighting hazard, this is a hard hat issue, this is a safety vest. Let's talk about other things related to the mental health. And I've told you guys that this is a $50 billion effect that it has on our economy here in Canada. Culture is shaped by those in control. So let's create not just a physical safety, let's create a psychologically safe workplace. And to do that, all of us in this room need to step up. All of us that are leaders in our industries, we need to step up and model the type of behavior that we want to see change what's been present and work towards the eradication of these numbers. Lieutenant General Morrison said this: the standard you walk past is the standard you uphold. So let's create a baseline when it comes to our culture going forward. There are lots of different reporting options for sexual violence, sexual harassment in the workplace. The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission is one, and this will all be provided in the chat for people you can reach out to. The Human Rights Commission, like I said, Occupational Health and Safety can investigate the complaints about harassment, personal, prohibited, or sexual. Workers' compensation, if you have had to or substantiated some sort of mental health injury because of what has happened in the workplace. And I do want to mention on here, if there's actually, it's been escalated to, the tip of that pinnacle that we saw of that triangle, and there's been an actual assault in the workplace, please call the police. Please reach out to that. If you're not sure, victim services exists with all our police agencies, and they can help walk alongside you. There's also support resources through SAS when it comes to reporting. I do want to say this to the employers in the room and just to everyone present, is that part of the employees' protection is they are allowed to seek, and it says so in the legislation, the appropriate remedy or option to rectify the situation. So it could be a lawsuit, it could be civil, they could report to the police, they could report to OHS, they could report to workers' comp. So again, let's be proactive. Let's provide our employees and those that work for us the best amount of information possible so they know what their rights are in the workplace. I'm going to stop right there because I am cognizant of the time. I just want to open it up to any Q&A in this room, and I want to also invite patients in on this chat and Tal, just to talk maybe about some more ongoing work with SAS, some ideas. But I also want to just throw this open for any questions about sexual harassment, about investigations, about best policy or practice, if you guys have any questions.
I'll start off as folks think about what they want to ask. Thank you, Stephen, so much for sharing that with us. So as you know, as Stephen sort of shared, the statistics are staggering, and our organization, though our primary function isn't just workplace harassment, we hear a lot from workers who have gone through sexual harassment in the workplace. And it's such a challenge for them because that's where they spend the majority of their time, and it impacts their livelihood, it impacts their security. And, I think it, my hunch, and I don't have necessarily the data to back this up, is I actually think when we think about sexual violence in itself as a form of, in all the different ways that it shows up, I think it's most commonly showing up in the workplace. And then the other form is child sexual abuse. And again, there's vulnerability for kids there. So that says that where we spend our time at work is actually probably one of the most dangerous places for a lot of people. And so these kinds of protections and these kinds of sort of guidelines are so important. And it's also a breeding ground for people who would wish to use their kind of inflict pain on other people, right? And if they can get away with it at work, they can also get away with it in their personal lives. So that timely intervention is so, so important, not just for the workers specifically, but also for the community at large. And what we've also heard is it's not just harmful for the person directly being impacted, but also for the people who are experiencing it. So some of the statistics that were shared around the men, in part for a lot of them, is that they're just also being subjected to that. And you don't necessarily want to say something because you don't also want the retaliation to turn on you. But then you go into that workplace and it feels gross, right? So we're trying to encourage workers everywhere and employers especially to take a proactive stance. When we've gone in and done training to workers, they've said to us, it doesn't matter anyways if my employer doesn't care about the issue. So I won't still report because I know they don't care. So, it really starts with the leadership, right? And that's where that place is. And we are looking at it from a non-punitive approach. We really are saying, we understand you care about your work. You want to get back into the business of doing whatever it is that you're there to do. So let us help you put the things in place, the procedures, the practices in place that allows you to prevent it from occurring in the first place, which is around culture, but also that if it does happen, that there's timely intervention so that you can just keep on moving, right? One of the things we've seen is sometimes investigations get botched because people don't know how to respond appropriately. Everybody gets involved. There's so much drama and gossip, and then it makes the situation worse. And so one of the things we're thinking about, for example, is maybe, as Stephen and I were thinking about doing a session on how to do investigations from a trauma-informed way, but also a way that's just really concise and clear and allows even the smallest of workplaces to just be able to do what they got to do and keep it moving, right? So if that's something that would be of interest to you, please let us know. If you have questions that you're dealing with in your workplace and you don't know necessarily what would be the best way to go about it, please let us know. We are continuously compiling information and building best practices. What we don't have answers for, we will find them. And we are part of a larger network. SAS, we work closely with the Saskatchewan Human Rights. We are also working with the Public Legal Education Association of Saskatchewan, which has a lot of other information there. So we are a network of organizations that are able to sort of compile this information and best practices also that we see from other jurisdictions that can help elevate our workplaces across the province. So please let us know. Send anyone in your way who's sort of not sure what to do. They can come to us as well. And we always refer them as well to all the legal, all the standard sort of systems, like we said, OH&S, workplace compensation, labor relations, safety, workplace safety. We do refer to all of those places as well, but we try to be at least that one-stop place that is a safe place for folks to ask for information and coming at it from that trauma-informed perspective. So again, for leadership, we say prevention is better than having to clean up a mess afterwards. So if there are things we can put in place to help you with that, that's, let us know and would be happy to help you. So I'll leave it up. If there's any questions that folks have, I don't know if Tal, you have anything that you want to share that we might have missed? No.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So in the beginning of the presentation, Stephen, you mentioned you talked about outside behavior. I'm just curious if, for example, something happens outside of the workplace, but you know, I feel like it's impacting my work, and I bring that up with my boss, and not necessarily it didn't happen within the organization, but outside, and I still involve my employer. um, does it become their issue? Do they still have to address it, or like it's in their knowledge, but they don't necessarily have to do anything about it yet?
Without knowing the nuances of that, I'd be hesitant to say something, but I would say this: if it's affecting your workplace performance, obviously reach out to your employer and use the services available to them, like EFAP or any employment counseling and stuff like that. But if something happened outside of the work that has now been brought in because an outside party has brought it in, then the employer has an obligation. So in my particular case, what happened was there were pictures sent off duty, out of work, in a garage on a weekend. On the Tuesday, a reference was made. Hey, I bet you liked what we sent you. That brought the outside weekend behavior, non-regulated about employee-employer relationship, into the workplace. It now affected the employee there. Nothing was said, not even about the full context of the picture. Just, hey, I bet you like those pictures. Boom. It's now everything's part and parcel of it. So without knowing the specifics, I'd be hesitant to say. But if you want to have a conversation outside of here, we can facilitate something like that specifically. But yeah, when the outside is brought in and there's a conduit and there's a direct line or a nexus that exists, then the employer would have an obligation, if that's a particular case, to investigate it.
Thank you.
The other thing I want to say about these investigations is sometimes people think that, oh, it's just an investigation. I'll look at it, I'll make a ruling, and then I'll throw it back and say, here's what I found. Under the legislation as it sits, whether an occupational health officer actually has the authority to order a new investigation. There's 3 grounds that have been upheld here in Saskatchewan for an investigation to be overthrown. The 3 grounds that have to be met, the threshold is the investigation has to be thorough, it has to be legal, it has to be without bias. So again, if it wasn't thorough, if you identify 12 witnesses, they talk to 1, that's not thorough. It has to be legal. Did you consider the right definition of what harassment is? I've seen cases where someone went to Webster's Merriam Dictionary and they said, oh, this is harassment. And then they said, oh, it doesn't fit. Well, sorry. Thank you for knowing how to spell it, but you have to actually look at what it says under the Employment Act and how it's specifically defined. And that's why I encourage all of you guys, go look at the definition of personal harassment, prohibited harassment, and sexual harassment. It's very nuanced and it's specific, and that has to be the basis from where the investigation flows. And again, there's the last part about bias. If the person conducting it, if there's something that's been established that makes it an unequal or unfair judgment, it's the employer's son that's the accused, so to speak, or something like that. Or if the accused investigates himself, that obviously has a huge bias, and under legislation, that investigation will be overthrown, and the courts have upheld that as a threshold. So it's not uncommon that investigations that don't meet that threshold are ordered over again. And even if sometimes if you do an investigation, it's a bigger company, it's a bigger issue, it's more complex. Sometimes you have to go hire an investigator, and I've seen those costs, $12,000 to $25,000, and at the end, even though it was done by a lawyer, there was still one of those grounds that wasn't met, and it can be overturned. And sorry, you're back at square one, starting over. Ask for a discount next time. Again, that's why when we talk about having this policy in place, when we talk about what needs to happen, how a complaint is put forward, what the employer's responsibility is upon receipt of that, how it's going to be investigated, how the complainant is made aware. Again, the complainant doesn't need to know and isn't entitled to know this. It was substantiated. Now this is happening to this person. They don't need to know the punishment. They don't need to know the suspension duration term. They just need to know at the end that an investigation was done. It was concluded. Harassment was substantiated. Here's how we're protecting you going forward. Harassment was not substantiated. Here's how we're going to work together to rectify the situation. So when we say investigation, there's actually a lot that has to happen. And that's why I think if SAS is willing to do something along those lines when it comes to investigation, it'd be very beneficial for people to understand just what needs to go into an actual investigation of harassment. personal, prohibited, or sexual.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We'll put again our contact in the chat. And if you have any questions that come up after this, feel free to let us know. We'll pass them on to Stephen as well, and he can for sure help us formulate some answers for you. I'll pass it back to Tao.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen, for your time today and for your excellent facilitation. Thank you, Patience, as well, for your insight, and everyone else who has joined us for this webinar. Thank you for your commitment to worker safety. I have in the chat the link to our final webinar, which will be on Friday at noon again, and that will be done by the Public Legal Education Association, and it will be about the SHIFT project. And it's about how workers can access justice after experiencing sexual violence. Please join us. We would be so delighted to see you there. The only thing left to say is I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us.